Okay, welcome to our final chapter for Biology 100, Chapter 18 on Conservation and Biodiversity. So let's jump in. So for this chapter, we're going to be covering what biodiversity is and how it actually is impactful to humans. Talk about how biodiversity is distributed around the globe based on some of the information we learned from Chapter 17. Talk about extinctions and what the actual causes of extinction are. Talk about both reversible and irreversible ecosystem disturbances, and then identify some key events that ultimately lead to disturbance and change, and then talk about strategies for preservation of these ecosystems. So, biodiversity is defined as the variety of genes, species, and ecosystems on Earth. And biodiversity has a lot of important value to humans. So, from different plants and animals, we can get a lot of different kinds of medicines that help as part of the healthcare system. Additionally, things like microbes help our metabolism and digestion as well. If you've ever bought something like a probiotic, that's useful for promoting good digestive health. And we get those things, again, from the earth. Biodiversity also has what we call intrinsic value, meaning that it is useful outside of its important relevance to humans. And the reason that biodiversity has this intrinsic value is that outside of just the human need for nature to provide us with services and goods and everything, biodiversity needs to be there to maintain stable ecosystems. So we need a lot of different kinds of life and life forms in these habitats to balance each other out, to have producers and consumers and parasites and decomposers and all these aspects of a community and an ecosystem in order for nature to actually continue to exist. So that outside of human usefulness is called intrinsic value. We also have what's called extrinsic value or utilitarian, and this is all of the ways that nature and biodiversity actually benefit us as humans. So 4 different categories that your book has for extrinsic value. First one is called provisioning services. So these are all the actual material we can get from the earth. So things like your food, things like water, things like medicine are all provisioning services. They are provisions. Next is habitat services. So based on the land that we actually live on, we are able to construct houses and construct shelters for ourselves to live. Same idea with that animals and other species using the habitat for shelter or for their habitat. Additionally, the earth and biodiversity provide a lot of regulating services. Through photosynthesis, we get air. We have rivers and streams that give us fresh water. The soil allows us to grow plants for agriculture. Additionally, we have carbon storage and climate regulation through plants that exist by utilizing photosynthesis and taking carbon out of the air. And then we have things like cultural services. So these are the aspects of nature and biodiversity that are more for pleasure and enjoyment. So just being beautiful and aesthetic allows us to go experience nature and go out and see it, leading to a lot of tourism opportunities, leading to a lot of recreational activities, providing benefits for mental health, as well as providing even spiritual experiences. Now, much like everything in biology, biodiversity exists at multiple levels. So biodiversity at the broadest level can be preserving ecosystems, talking about the diversity of ecosystems. At a mid-tier level, we can just talk about species, so protecting and looking at all the different array of species. But then we also have it at a microscopic level, talking about genes and alleles. So having diversity in terms of having a mix of individuals who are homozygous dominant, heterozygous dominant, and homozygous recessive, or having the possibility to pass on a dominant or recessive gene to offspring. So 3 levels we look at. And with biodiversity, we have this field called conservation biology. And this field is all about addressing how do we preserve this nature and these species and these ecosystems and these genes. So it goes across many, many different kinds of levels. And that conservation biology is a mix of a lot of different fields. So of course, biology, ecology, knowing the actual science behind these ecosystems and these communities and how things actually work. But you also have areas like government and law in terms of passing bills and regulations to preserve these things as well. You have also sociological implications where in areas that are urbanized, how do these changes affect people? How do these regulations ultimately interact with people? How do we get them to be able to obey them? There's an education component as well, teaching people about why conservation is important. Why do we need it? So conservation biology is kind of a mishmash of a lot of different fields. So on Earth, we know we have a vast array of biodiversity, but where does the actual greatest amount of biodiversity occur? If you remember from the last chapter, when we talked about ecosystems and communities, we looked at the sun's rays and how these sun's rays actually differ depending on where it's being shined on the planet. So we learned that the equator has the highest intensity of sunlight because the sunlight is hitting the Earth at a perpendicular, a perfect 90-degree angle, versus as you move towards the poles, where that light is being spread over a greater area. What that means is that there's higher productivity in the equator, which ultimately leads to more species richness and ultimately more diversity overall. So as a general trend, when we're talking about the equator, that tends to have the greatest biodiversity at the 0-degree point. And then as we move away, either to the north or to the south, that biodiversity decreases. So greatest at the equator, decreases as we move towards the poles. And that reflects, as we talked about in the last chapter, the having to do with the sun and the angle that it hits the Earth. So one way we can talk about biodiversity in an ecosystem is through what's called species richness. And species richness we just define as the number of species in an area. So we're just talking about a physical count, how many different types of species are there in some area of space. And this is affected by a couple different factors. So the first one, as I mentioned in the last slide, is the solar energy available. So where are we on the Earth impacts how the sunlight is actually hitting the Earth and how much solar energy is available for plants to use to contribute to photosynthesis, which adds to the number of plant species that we can have. And the more plant species you can have, the more amount of species you can have at higher trophic levels. So more herbivores, more secondary consumers, more tertiary consumers. All of those are supported by the base level of the energy pyramid, which is plant life. Next, we have the evolutionary history of an area. So the more time that a community has without major climatic events, so overhunting or huge disasters, allows for greater diversification to happen. And the last one actually seems a little counterintuitive, but we do find that it also contributes to species richness overall, and that is the rate of disturbance. You would think that you wouldn't want an ecosystem to have any kind of disturbance in order to maximize its richness, but that's actually not quite the case. We find that as ecosystems go through succession and reach a climatic community, the end result is actually a community that has only a certain number of species and not the most rich amount. So we find that when you have habitats that have an intermediate amount of disturbance, so not a lot, but not too little, kind of an average amount, ultimately that leads to additional opportunities for succession, and that allows for new species to colonize the area and ultimately contribute to a greater species richness. Okay. And across the Earth, we have what are called reservoirs of biodiversity. So these are major areas that house a bulk of the species on Earth. And you can see everything here in green is represented as a biodiversity hotspot. Many of them you'll note are at the equator, like much of Central America, a lot of South America, areas of Africa, and then a lot of the islands in the Pacific Ocean in terms of the Philippines and Korea, Vietnam, southern China, all of that. And all of these hotspots have, collectively the 25 hotspots, cover less than 1% of the world area. So they don't take up a lot of space, but they have more than 20% of the world's species. So very small area, but very diverse area. And that covers a lot of different types of habitats. So tropical rainforest, island life, coral reefs, just to name a few. And with these biodiversity areas, of course, there is always the instance that we can have extinction. And we know from previous chapters that extinction is just the complete removal or wiping out of a population of species. Some of this happens naturally, we know, just over the course of time, and some of it happens through interventions, either through disasters or through human intervention. But on average, species are going to persist for about 10 million years. Just the general evolutionary pathway that species have that tends to be the lifetime of a species. However, this timeline can be accelerated based on if there's human intervention or some more sort of disaster. One of the examples your book gives is the passenger pigeon. And if you see this photograph right here in black and white, these are all of these birds that were caught from overhunting in the early 1900s. Ultimately, there was no regulations in place to protect the passenger pigeon, so people just hunted it and hunted it and hunted it to extinction. And ultimately, since that was a huge human intervention, ultimately that led to a mass extinction for that species. So also from the previous chapter, we learned about, or previous unit, excuse me, we learned about the two categories of extinctions. We learned about mass extinction, when a large number of species become extinct over a very short period, or we have background extinctions when they occur at lower rates. Depending on what type of disturbance we're talking about, that can influence if it's a background or a mass extinction. And there are a couple factors that ultimately influence the extinction risk of a species that we'll go through one by one. The first one is the geographic range. So ultimately, does the species have an extensive geographic range, or does it have a restricted geographic range? If you look on this diagram right here on the left, we have all this green highlighted area in all of Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, or sorry, not Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, and then southern China. That is a potential distribution of one single type of species across a wide area. So it has a very extensive geographic range. However, on the other hand, we have this example where there is just one island, Tasmania, off the coast of southern Australia, that the species in question here only occupies. So if a major disaster were to occur, and that wiped out the island, that species would be gone from existence. However, if you had an extensive geographic range and this island got wiped out, you'd still have the species existing in all these other areas to allow it to persist. So the more extensive the geographic range, the less likely it is to go extinct. Second major characteristic that dictates the extinction risk is the local population size. So how large or small is a population? Same idea kind of with the geographic or the extensive and the narrow geographic range. If you have a population that has a lot of species in it, that species, if it has some sort of disaster, is going to have, just by pure numbers game, is going to have individuals left over after that disaster. But if you have a population that's very small, if you have some sort of disaster, most likely that's going to wipe out most of the members of that population. And lastly is habitat tolerance. And this is going to vary species to species. So species may have a broad habitat tolerance, or they may have a narrow habitat tolerance. What that means is, what are the conditions that the species can actually put up with and survive in to ultimately produce offspring? So if you have very broad habitat tolerance, meaning you can live in a lot of different types of habitat. For example, this bird is capable of living on the ground, in the tops of the trees, and on branches in the middle of the tree, we'll say. That has a lot of different microhabitats that it can live throughout. So if it gets outcompeted by another animal, or for some reason it can't exist in a certain part of the forest, it can move to one of these locations in the habitat and be fine. However, if a bird has a very narrow habitat tolerance, meaning it can only exist in one microhabitat in the environment, in the forest, we'll say, that means if it gets competed or gets outcompeted by another species, or it gets hunted, or part of the forest gets destroyed and it can't occupy that specific area of the habitat, it's going to go extinct because it doesn't have the resources it needs to survive. So ultimately right now, wild extinctions do happen naturally, with on average species lasting 10 million years. We as humans are actually the major culprit of mass extinctions. And just to give you some general numbers, you don't have to know these numbers for the exam, but it's just here for some context. We roughly have over 10% of all of our mammals that are endangered because of us, 4% of all bird species, a third of amphibian species because we destroy so many wetlands. Additionally, because we destroy so many aquatic habitats through pollution or through overfishing. We have a dire situation for a lot of fish, a lot of your other marine life like mollusks, potentially also in forests, a lot of insects and fungi and plants also destroyed as well. So because we're constantly destroying habitat or causing pollution or other issues, we actually have wiped out a good majority of species, and unfortunately it doesn't look like that rate of extinction is going to stop. And the reason for this is because of human activity overall. So the biggest thing that contributes to the extinction of these species is habitat loss and degradation. So because human population growth is still considered explosive, we're still going at an exponential rate. Ultimately, a lot of people are existing, so we're having to develop land more and more and branch out, and ultimately a lot more people are going to cities, so there's a lot more urban development. And because we have to feed all these people, agriculture now has to step up and produce a lot more product for us to all eat. Ultimately, between urban development and agriculture, we have to cut down forests, remove wetlands, build infrastructure, which all gets rid of habitat, and ultimately contributes to species loss. A big example of this is with the tropical forests, in that we have lost pretty much half the tropical forest in the last 25 years, just because we need trees for timber and paper products, and also just development. So a lot of that has contributed to getting rid of those forests. In the same vein, just that overexploitation of resources, just cutting down things or destroying things because we need the space or the resources, ultimately drives animal populations to extinction. So your book gives the examples of the bonobos, one of the close relatives for human that have been driven to extinction because of hunting, because we hunted the bonobos because we wanted them for the meat or the fur or some other part of the body to use for trade or what have you. But ultimately, the idea is still the same. It's overexploiting something that we don't necessarily need to, or not doing something in as efficient as a way as we could, which is leading to a species extinction. And with all of these extinctions, we have two different types of disturbances, depending on if they're extinctions or not. And if we have the ability to preserve species in an environment, we call that disturbance reversible. If it's not, if we do remove species or have extinction, we call it irreversible. One example of a possible reversible change is that agriculture areas that have been abandoned can potentially go back to forests through ecological succession. So that would be an example of secondary succession, because we had a disturbance there previously, and now the environment is left to grow anew. But for ecosystem disturbances, they are reversible if those biotic and abiotic conditions don't cause those change in the biotic and abiotic conditions don't cause a change in the extinction of species. So an example your book gives is at Mount St. Helens in Washington State. 1980, there was a huge eruption, and all of this ash covered the forest below, wiped out all of the plant and animal species, ultimately. But over the course of about 30 years, you did have secondary succession because some of the soil and life was still intact. So you did have new plant life grow, you did have insect communities and mammal communities start to come back with the succession in time. So ultimately, because we could reverse that, we didn't destroy all the species in the area, it could bounce back. However, in instances where these species go extinct, this is called an irreversible disturbance, because once you remove the species, you can't get it back. You don't get to put the genie back in the bottle once that happens. Once it's gone forever. You might have evolution produce something similar or a closely related species, but you can never have that exact species back. And past examples of this we see are with the Tasmanian wolves in Tasmania, Chinese river dolphins, and then currently the big one in danger is the blue whale, which is known to be the largest animal ever to have lived on Earth. So it's kind of a big evolutionary deal that potentially could go away forever. Okay, I'll stop part 1 there, and we'll pick up with part 2 in a moment.